It's 1983. Return of the Jedi has just been released. 3D printing is invented.
The Pioneer 1
is the first spacecraft to leave our solar system. And the Lancia Beta Coupe Volume X is launched. The Beta Saloon came out in 1972, and in 73 the Coupe, 20 centimetres shorter, was released. It was a key car for Lancia because it was the very first one released entirely under Fiat ownership. It has three very unusual engineering choices. The first is front-wheel drive. At the time it was considered quite an advanced thing and very unusual, especially for a sports car to have. The Beta series was the first not to use a Lancia engine. Horror of horrors, this used a Fiat lump. Luckily though, it wasn't just any ordinary Fiat engine. This was the masterpiece designed by Lampredi. It was the twin cam, to which Lancia did their own additions. And here is the third weird solution that they picked. When everybody else was going mad about turbocharging, Lancia went back to something that most European manufacturers hadn't been using for ages: supercharging. Not only did they adopt such a weird technical solution, but this engine only produced 13 horsepower more than the normally aspirated one at 135 horsepower. It really barely seems worth the bother, but there is some method to the madness. Let's drive it, I'll tell you what it's like, and we'll find out more about those choices. First of all, you have to realise that when this car was released, the Volume X, it's almost 10 years after the Coupe originally came out. So it came out in 73 and this was released in 83. By that stage, the car world had changed drastically from the early 70s. In those days, you basically usually had like a family car, and if you wanted to make a sports car, you made a coupe version of that car. But by the early 80s, the hatchback GTIs were king. Most manufacturers are on the way to phasing out their sort of sporty coupes, and they were betting everything on the sort of hotted up GTIs and hotted up versions of their normal cars. So the Volume X had a tough job ahead of it. And as mentioned, Lancia made quite a strange choice to use the supercharger. Why did they do that? Well, 83 was also the year with which Lancia won the World Rally Championship with the very last two-wheel drive car. That was the North 37, and tellingly, that used a supercharger. There is more in common between these two cars than you might think, because the engine in the North 37 is very closely related to this. The main difference, really the biggest difference, is that it used a bigger supercharger, but you can understand why Lancia, having gone down that route for rallying, decided that they would sort of reap the marketing benefits, I guess, for the road cars. Not just that, but if it's good enough for rallying, if they believed it, then obviously supercharging should be good enough for road cars too. The weird thing is though, it hardly seems worth the bother for just 13 horsepower. Why would you go to all that trouble? And I think as I'm driving, I kind of understand the answer. The performance of this car is, I would describe as peppy. There's enough power there so you don't feel shortchanged, but it certainly isn't a speed monster. I think that where it comes into its own compared to, say, a turbocharged car is, first of all, the throttle response. This feels hardly changed to me from a normal twin cam. It's just as quick, it's just as snappy off the throttle. It doesn't suffer from any turbo lag, and where it shines is in the mid-range. I'm at 2,500 revs here, put my foot down, and it responds smoothly and instantly. Now remember that Lancias, although there is that rally heritage, were more known as sort of luxury GT cars than out and out sports cars often. So having this solution with the more drivability and the more torque would have made sense. I still think they could have tried to get a little bit more top end horsepower out of it. As it is, it's very, very linear. There doesn't seem to be much point revving it past about 5.5. Now chassis-wise, the Bitter, the saloon was revolutionary because it had independent suspension all-round, disc brakes, a 5-speed gearbox, and obviously this inherited all that, and front-wheel drive. Let's just see how it copes with the tight hairpins here. The beauty of the engine is you don't have to rev it too hard, but for this, down into second. And it will lean a bit, but not excessively. Holds the road quite well. The steering I find maybe a little bit overly light, but it does seem to have good grip up front. Let's just take it up through the gears again and see. Five and a half is probably the sweet spot. The brakes are all right, and it's pretty wieldy in the corners. It's an agile little car. I don't know the weight now, but all these cars tend to be lighter, and you can really feel it. Doesn't suffer much from understeer, and there isn't enough power to trouble you in terms of getting torque steer. It's good, and actually, you know what? You can rev it up to about, it does continue to pull up to about 6. It's redlined at about 6.3. And I did think 5.5 is where it started to tail off. Maybe it does slightly, but you can pull it up to close to 6. I was never quite sure what to make of the look of these cars. Both the saloons had a bit of an ugly notchback, I think. Never particularly like those. The coupes, you couldn't say that they weren't pretty cars, but I was never totally enamored with them. But having seen it today, it is quite a nice design. It's got a low slung look about it. The twin headlights at the front give it just the right bit of aggression. And then you come to this interior, which is very sort of late 70s, mid 70s, 80s. I don't know if they changed them much over the production run. I imagine that they didn't. It's all pretty simple. There's acres of plastic. You have these lovely Recaro chairs, which are pretty comfortable, maybe a little bit loose for me, to be honest, but keep you in place in the corners. And the clear instrumentation, which has hints of other Lancias as well. I mean, it's a shame it's just a sea of black plastic apart from the trim, because actually the dashboard has an interesting sort of shape to it, with a vertical line running across. The heating controls here, the radio set in the proper place above, so you don't have to lower your sight line to operate it. It's all pretty logical, and there aren't many squeaks or rattles either. Now, I have to say that this example is probably one of the best you'll ever see. It was built by Patrick Hurst in Northern Ireland, who almost restored these as a hobby because it wasn't commercially viable. And the guys who brought it to me, Kevin and Rich as well, you know, they love this thing, and it is so good. I have rarely seen something in quite such a nice state. It's restored, but not over-restored. It just looks absolutely right. You sit taller than you would expect by looking at the car from outside. It seems quite low slung, and it's a sports car, but when you get in it, actually you can see that my head is almost brushing the ceiling, the roof, Of course, I am on the tall side, I'm 6'1", but all the same, I would have expected some room, and I'm pretty sure that these chairs, I can feel it, they're not adjustable for height. So in our driving position, the steering wheel as well is tilted forward. It's about the right size, the rim is right as well, it's lovely leather, but it's got that bus driver tilted driving position. This does have another weird idiosyncrasy, and that is that the lower engine, so the naturally aspirated 2 litre, had the more advanced fuel injection, whereas this, for some reason, with the supercharger, went back to using carbs. There must be some technical reason. Fuel injection was still in its infancy in those days, and perhaps the addition of a supercharger made it difficult to set up. All the same, another very odd technical solution that they picked for that. The action on the gearbox isn't an out-and-out success. So when you're driving it normally, you can feel that there is a little bit of notchiness in there perhaps, but it doesn't seem to get in the way too much if you're not shifting it too quickly. If you're trying to rev match though, and you want to sort of get the gear changed very quickly, then that notchiness gets in the way a little bit. It just doesn't like to be rushed. Oh. Popped out a gear there in 5th, but that was my fault, I think. For a car designed in the 70s, the Ride is on the sporty side of firm, but I do believe that the Volume X had a firmer setup than the standard cars. By modern standards, it's still more than acceptable. And of course, having those tyres with a big sort of big profile means that there's an extra bit of squidginess, both to the ride, but also to the response to the steering inputs. The front drive setup may not convince all, but in normal driving and even spirited driving, it just doesn't come into the equation. There's so much grip up front that understeer isn't something that you're going to suffer. It's got the very light steering, which gives it good agility as well. And the suspension, you know, by the time you get past the levels of grip, you're beyond really what the suspension can handle. So it's not the way it would be driven in any case. The Coupe then was a really good car, and the Volume X was an interesting addition to the range. And yet, this model range, the Beta in general, was largely responsible for Lancia's downfall. It gained a terrible reputation for rust. Now, this was largely due to the saloon which this is based on, but there are some differences that meant that these didn't suffer quite as much. So most people think that Lancia's rust problem was to do with Fiat Group in general using substandard Russian steel. There is absolutely no truth to that story. What did happen is that in the front subframe of the saloon cars, there was a design flaw which left a pocket for water to pool in. That would then rust out, weaken the subframe, so there were even stories of engines dropping out of cars. I think those are exaggerated, but the truth of it is that the UK was Lancia's largest market outside of Italy. And the Lancia Beta range, the saloon specifically, completely killed it off in that market. It was a real debacle. And it's a shame because these were clearly good cars. I'm not sure still if having the Volume X on it was enough to try and make it compete with its larger engine German rivals, but all the same, I think they're good cars and they would have stood a much better chance. Thank you so much to Kevin and Rich for having brought this down to me today. This is, as I've mentioned, an absolutely beautiful model, so it's been a privilege to be driving such a great car. If you've enjoyed this, I will put up some links to some of my other Lancia videos. There's the traditional Flaminia from an era where Lancia was absolutely no compromise, and there's the story of the real reason why Lancias and Fiats rusted. Nothing to do with the myth of Soviet steel. Do check those out if you're interested. And thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you for the next video.